Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm a past member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and currently I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering those questions and connecting you to resources. Natural disasters are unpredictable. They can occur at any time, producing outcomes that can range from bad to worse. Now, that may sound like a description of an MS relapse, but these types of extraordinary events can produce added challenges for people living with MS. The best way to prepare for any type of emergency is to have a disaster preparedness plan. And today, Mary Casey-Lockyer, the Senior Medical Advisor to National Disaster Operations at the American Red Cross, is here to share how you can protect yourselves and your families in an emergency, so you can feel confident should a natural disaster occur close to where you live. Welcome, Mary, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited about this program.
You know, there's no getting around the fact that natural disasters are traumatic, especially if you have specific medical needs. But we know that pre-planning can help lessen the impact and reduce stress for everyone. So, Mary, what kinds of emergencies and disasters are we talking about today? And I'm wondering, are there any specific types of emergencies or disasters that tend to happen more frequently?
Well, actually, there are two types of disasters. One is a notice event, and some are no notice events. Hurricanes, believe it or not, are actually a notice event. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, services like the National Weather Service or a good website like Tropical Tidbits track the formation of hurricanes and typhoons that may impact the U.S. and provides a prediction of the path of the storm many days out so you can prepare from expected impact. A no-notice event, however, could be a tornado, earthquake, or a fast-moving wildfire. You need to stay alert to watches and warnings from local authorities for all events. And you asked a question about what happens more frequently than others. And believe it or not, it is a single family fire. Red Cross responds to over 60,000 single family fires every year and multifamily fires. And for that household, that is a disaster. And so we need to remember to be prepared not only for big events, but for things that could happen to a single household.
Tell me, why is planning in advance for a natural disaster so important?
It's very important in these days, whether you espouse climate change or not. Since 1980, the U.S. has sustained 258 weather and climate disasters, where the overall damage costs reached or exceeded $1 billion. Including adjustments based on the Consumer Price Index as of January 2020. So the cumulative cost of these events exceeds $1.75 trillion. Hurricanes and wildfires are occurring at increased rates over the past 5 years, and hurricanes are increasing in size, strength, and spinning up more quickly. As you see, Hurricane Ian had a big path of impact across the state of Florida, from Fort Myers in Lee County all the way up to Daytona. And it was a category 4, which is a very strong surge and strong wind event along with rain. And there were at least 115 fatalities during that storm. So you really need to know the threat areas on the geographic area in which you live. It's important to prepare also to reduce fear, anxiety, stress, certain barriers, and make the recovery process easier. People living with MS face unique challenges and have medical needs. Planning for these situations is critical to protecting yourself and your family.
We're going to talk more about that last point you made in just a moment, but we've heard from Jake, who lives in Kentucky, and he tells us that Kentucky is a high-risk region for tornadoes, landslides, earthquakes, and hurricanes. And Jake's wondering, how should he go about planning for all of these?
Well, you can have what's called an all-hazard plan, which means there's a basic plan that you have for emergencies. But there are unique things about each one of them, and you have to think about that and how they would affect you uniquely. For instance, a flooding is different than a landslide. Landslides move fast. Flooding can be very slow and kind of creep up on you. Hurricanes, you're going to probably know about, but earthquakes, not so much. So you really need to plan for the threats in your area. There's also heat waves or drought with water restrictions that affect only your home. And then I mentioned fire and things like blizzards. So it's important to take a look at the unique aspects, but also to have a basic plan for what you and your household would do in case of an emergency.
The American Red Cross urges all of us to become Red Cross ready for any urgent situation. What does it mean to be Red Cross ready?
Well, that's a great phrase, and we mostly define that by assembling emergency kits, something you can grab and go, making a plan, that's what we talked about just before, and being informed, and that's the most important. But I think adding what I call as the quote unquote trusted neighbor plan is important too. Who will assist you with evacuation if you are unable to drive? Who will assist you if you need accessible transportation? And who will assist with helping you take your backpack or motorized scooter into your accessible van? And that's why I call it sort of that trusted neighbor plan. Who's going to come and help you? And what have you discussed between each other? Because sometimes you're going to need more help than maybe your household members aren't even home when you need to evacuate. So you're going to need some touch point in the community as a support system.
That's great advice. Let's spend a little time breaking it down, talking about some of the details there. For instance, what are some of the supplies that people with MS should include in their emergency kit?
Well, in addition to basic needs like having, that space blanket to keep you warm or other items, but people with MS may need to take a list of their doctors, the medications, name and strength of the prescription, plus a pharmacy name, an address, and a phone number. Plan to keep refrigerated medications cold. And here's can be some simple things you can do to make these plans. Do you have a cooler you can put an ice pack in to keep medication cool? And I use an ice pack rather than just throwing ice cubes in that cooler, because that could actually get the temperature too low for the medication. There's also some really cool cooling sacks that you can get in camping stores, and you can put the ice or ice pack in there, and that's really good if you need to have a refrigerated syringe type medication. And I talked about the cooler. What else do you need? It's very difficult to require a month's worth of medication to have separately, but it is possible to be sure to bring your medications with you. And you may be able to get 2 weeks of medications, but make sure you bring the medication that you have with you and identify it. If it's in a container, that's great, but we need to know the name and the strength of the medication. Think about what you may need to maintain a reasonable body temperature. Do you need a personal fan if high heat exacerbates your MS? Or do you need a warm blanket if cold temperatures are an issue for you? Just the thoughts.
We heard from Bella, who said creating an emergency plan is obviously a good idea, but it can feel overwhelming because of all the details you need to keep track of. What should be top of mind when someone's making that plan, and what's the best way to get started?
Well, I think the best way to get started is to understanding the biggest threats in your geographical area where you live. We had that individual from Kentucky, and he listed all the things that might happen in the state of Kentucky. And I think it's important. But I also think, if you live in the Gulf states, you may have hurricane. If you live on any coastal state at all, you could have a hurricane. Look at what happened in Hurricane Sandy up in the New York area. So you're at a threat for hurricanes, floods, especially in the Midwest, wildfires in the West. But you may think you don't have any threats, such as a lot of northern Midwesterners don't think they have threats, but indeed they do. Blizzards, cold temperatures, power outages, and again, that single family fire. You need a smoke detector in your house that is working at all times.
Well, I think you started answering my next question already, but it's an important one. Knowing that you can count on friends, neighbors, and colleagues can help you cope during challenging times. Can you talk about the importance of that support system during a disaster?
Well, I was talking about the Trusted Neighbor Plan, and you will feel more supported, less anxious if you have built a support system. Knowing that you can count on friends or neighbors or colleagues will boost your morale and help you cope during challenging times. Get to know your neighbors. It's one of the best things you can do to promote neighborhood safety.
We know that an emergency can occur at any time, so it's important to also be prepared at our place of employment as well as at school. What should people, or I should say, who should people be talking about when they talk about emergency preparedness at their place of employment or their school? And what are the questions that they should be asking?
This is a really important point. Talk with your facility safety officer or facility management lead, especially where you're employed. Most facilities have that facility safety officer or facility management lead. They are charged with making emergency plans for that building. And don't hesitate to talk to school principals or university or college safety departments. And if you're a parent, make sure that you understand what the school's plan is for emergency. How are you going to reunify with your child? Are they going to be kept? Many schools have, in the beginning of the school year, a list of what you want to do with your child. Do you want them to stay at the school? Do you want only certain people to pick them up, or only you pick them up? So you really have to pay attention to what the school's plan is. And it could be that they might have to shelter in place for a number of hours, and that's important. Are they asking you to bring, granola bars and water to help support sheltering in place? But you really have to make sure that the principal, the leaders of the schools, the safety officers in the college environment have articulated what that emergency plan is.
The Red Cross advises us that staying safe means staying informed. What kind of information should people be aware of during an emergency, and where should they look for that information?
Well, you really need to look to local authorities. They will be the ones who will notify you during a disaster and how you will get information. Radio, TV, or that NOAA weather radio we talked about. That's very handy to have in your house because you will get warnings and watches through that. It's advisable to have yourself or a member of your household trained in first aid and CPR too. That is very helpful to keep you safe, but you really have to be informed about what is happening around you in your geographic area.
We heard from Craig, who told us that he had to evacuate his home last year because of a hurricane. Craig said it would have been helpful to learn about all the accessible shelters in his area before that hurricane hit. So tell me, Mary, what we know that evacuation is common in several types of emergency situations. How should people plan for evacuation? And how do you go about finding shelters in your area?
Well, you can find shelters on your community's emergency management website or your county website. Now, if you lose connectivity, that's problematic. So that's why you want to listen to that NOAA weather radio. They may direct you to shelters. You can also go to redcross.org, and shelters are identified there on that website. But all shelters should be accessible, but that is not always the case. Red Cross makes every attempt to have accessible shelters or make accommodations as quickly as possible after the storm passes. So if you see a shelter identified as a Red Cross shelter, which you might not see on your county emergency management page or even in Red Cross, you cannot be guaranteed that those shelters are Red Cross managed. There's many types of shelters, Red Cross managed, Red Cross partner shelters where we provide material resources, and independent shelters, which are run by counties or states. So a little tour around your county or state emergency management website would be really good for your planning.
Do shelters provide blankets, food, basic toiletries, or do you have to bring all of that with you?
Well, it depends on the type of shelter. If you're evacuating, say, a hurricane, and your county has said you need to evacuate north or south or wherever, you might end up at an evacuation shelter. Unfortunately, evacuation shelters are very basic. You need to bring a blanket. You need to bring some snacks, some water. You might have to sleep on the floor. There may not be cots there. However, after the storm passes, if you need to stay in a shelter for a longer period of time, say 2 to 7 days, there are cots, blankets. Red Cross provides comfort kits, which are toiletries. Of course, feeding and of course, water is available also. So it's a different mindset when you have evacuation shelters and more long-term shelters that you have to wait out the damage that hurricane might have caused.
Even if you aren't injured or your home isn't damaged during a natural disaster, these kinds of events can still take a psychological and a financial toll. What are some of the emotions that someone might experience? What are some of the changes they might experience after a natural disaster has hit their area?
Well, you're used to being in a certain environment and knowing how to manage there. A disaster can change that. You might need to ask for help putting your home back in order or filling out forms for disaster relief agencies. You, your care partner, or family members might experience anxiety, irritability, depression, isolation, or guilt, and those are all normal reactions to disaster. Flashbacks, anger, and sleep disruption are also common. You might experience physical changes, including weakness, numbness or tingling, a heavy feeling in the arms, tremors, fatigue, or an increase in allergies, colds, or flu. The biggest thing is to know when these reactions are beyond the normal. You're going to be anxious if you don't know what's happened to your home. That's normal. You might feel a little irritable because, well, I have my wallet, but I have my driver's license, but how do I fill out this FEMA form? I can't even read it. Federal Emergency Management Agency. So, I don't know what this all means. I don't have the deed to my property. You're going to feel anxious. But when it does cause sleep disruption or anger that is not usual for you, ask for help. Many agencies bring disaster mental health that can offer comfort and crisis intervention during these times.
What types of emergency assistance programs are available to help people after a disaster strikes?
Well, there's many assistance programs, but they're listed here. You have a link, National MS Society .org, Living Well with MS, Home and Leisure / Emergencies and Disasters. I think that'll be on your resource page. But the federal emergency management agencies, you go to their website and they will outline the programs that there are to assist disaster survivors. There are many national voluntary organizations active in disaster, which is Red Cross is one of them, but there are many. Veterans Affairs has a very robust disaster support for those individuals who are veterans. Believe it or not, applying for a small business loan is really important if it is a large federal disaster. And all of these are with financial assistance, but also trying to guide you through recovery for your home, your possessions, etc. There's many. Again, I'd say a little tour, that Federal Emergency Management Agency website will help you know what to do in federal disasters, federally declared disasters. You might not have that. You might only have a regional disaster. So what are your community resources, your human services resources that you might have in your agency? For instance, Centers for Independent Living, area agencies on aging. All of that is, all of those community organizations will assist after disaster.
As you just mentioned, the National MS Society also supports people affected by MS through crises like natural disasters. What are some of the resources and services that the Society can help with?
So the MS navigators are ready to connect people to emergency shelters and other critical needs. They may also offer resources after the initial emergency has passed, such as referrals for temporary living assistance, temporary medical equipment, access to medications, emotional support, or for other challenges. MS navigators are available through phone, email, and chat, and we will have the contact information on the screen in just a few minutes. I would also say, if you're in a high threat area along the coastal areas or in areas that flood or have wildfire, really kind of get familiar with what federal programs there are. If it's a federally declared disaster, what are the community human resources within your own community that might be able to help? I think that's really important, because some people get in a disaster situation and they really haven't used the Center for Independent Living or haven't used the area agency on aging. And so it's good to explore a little bit when you are trying to make your plan.
Well, you shared some really helpful and important insights about being prepared for a disaster. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our viewers to remember?
First, know the threats in your area. That's crucial to your success in planning a good emergency response. And secondly, you already know this. Know what you need to stay safe and healthy, and get support to do those things that you need to stay safe and healthy. Remember that trusted neighbor plan. And thirdly, plan to follow community emergency instructions. If you're asked to evacuate, please evacuate. Don't think you can write it out. You need to evacuate, because these are experts, emergency management experts, which are giving you that recommendation. And that's it for me.
Well, thanks for sharing your expertise with us, Mary. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions from our viewers. Teresa tells us that she lives alone and she doesn't drive. And Teresa is wondering if there are services that offer transportation to a shelter during an emergency evacuation.
So you really need to check, Teresa, with your community's emergency management agency. Now, the emergency manager in some communities may be a law enforcement sergeant or a fire captain. You really have to do a little digging. Maybe you have to go to City Hall or your community county building and find out who is the emergency management for your area. The Red Cross does not provide transportation. That's a community-wide plan. So does the community have a plan for paratransit? And what does that mean if you need to evacuate? Do you need to let the paratransit get, make an appointment for 24 hours? Sometimes that's not, you can't do that if you have a fast moving wildfire or something. So it's really important that you connect with and be vocal, be assertive that you need to know what the community's plan is.
Becky heard that in some places, the local electricity provider, they maintain a registry of people with health conditions so they can receive status updates and priority for power restoration during an emergency. And Becky wants to know whether this is true. What can you tell us about that?
Well, unfortunately, it's not entirely correct. Because the utility restoration is based on community needs, such as hospitals, law enforcement, 9/11 centers, water treatment plants, etc. There's a lot of problematic issues with registries. How are they kept up to date? You may not be in the address where you have signed up for that registry. You may have evacuated. Registries are a tool that some communities like, but we haven't found them effective for rescue or restoration of power. Now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk to your utility company and say, what is your plan to prioritize those individuals who need electrical power to maintain their health? That's a question that your utility company should really be able to answer for you. It really depends on your community, because sometimes, they can restore the main line, but then they have to restore the electricity to your very house. And there's the issue, the block with the nice cul-de-sac might not get restored quick as fast as the block with the hospital. So I think it's a question of really pressing your utility companies on what should I be doing and what will you be doing.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted questions, and thank you for being with us today, Mary.
Wonderful to be here.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups. You'll find ways for you to get involved, and you'll hear about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Mary for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Mary Casey-Lockyer and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe